Some love stories start with a letter, or a rescue, or a look across a crowded room. This one started with a dog who couldn't stay out of Ivy Larkin's garden, no matter how many times she chased him out of it. Ivy was in the kitchen when the hens started screaming. "Samson," she said to no one, and was already moving before she'd finished saying it. She'd know that particular pitch of chicken outrage anywhere by now. Samson had a gift for finding the one gap in the world where a dog wasn't supposed to be, and had been proving it since April. Out in the yard, he was tearing after her hens in wide, gleeful circles, and by the time she'd chased him off, he'd flattened half a row of cabbage on the way through. Not all of it. Ivy had gotten faster at damage control since April, too. "That's it," she told him, snatching the broom off the porch. "That's the last straw. I mean it this time." Samson, sitting in the wreckage with his tongue out, did not appear to believe her. What followed wasn't really a chase, since a chase implies some chance of catching the thing being chased. Ivy came at him with the broom raised. Samson trotted 10 feet off and sat back down, watching her with open delight. She advanced. He repeated the trick, 10 more feet down the fence line, tail going the whole time like this was the best part of his week. "I will build a wall," Ivy informed him, breathing hard, "with my own 2 hands." Samson yawned. By the 4th attempt, she was out of patience and breath. And when he sat looking at her with the same maddening calm, she hurled the broom, not at him, just in his general direction, mostly to have somewhere to put her fury. Samson took it as his cue, bolted for the fence, squeezed under a gap he'd apparently been saving for exactly this purpose, and vanished onto the bishop side of the line. Ivy stood a moment with her hands on her knees, catching her breath. Then she looked at the cabbage. Then she marched to the fence. "Cole Bishop!" In the workshop behind his cabin, Cole Bishop had a table leg clamped in the vise and a chisel in his hand, enjoying the particular quiet of a man who'd bought 40 acres the previous spring in a Wyoming territory town of 200 people, specifically to be left alone with it. It was a different kind of work than what he used to do, the kind that didn't leave sawdust, and he'd found that wood held still, cooperated, forgave a bad cut if a man was patient enough to fix it. People, in his experience, rarely did. Samson had found the gap in that quiet back in April, the same week he'd found the gap in Ivy Larkin's fence. And Cole had more or less given up expecting the quiet to come back. He heard the dog before he heard her. Then he heard her. "Cole Bishop!" He set down the chisel. He came around the side of the cabin, wiping sawdust from his hands, and found Ivy at the fence line with an expression that suggested this was not a conversation that could wait. "Your dog just tore through my cabbage. Again." "He does that." "Yes, I know he does that." Her voice climbed half an octave. "I was the one chasing him around my yard with a broom for it." Something that might have been amusement crossed Cole's face and was gone before she could be sure of it. "Sorry to hear it." "You're not sorry. You're paying for the cabbage." "How much this time?" "That's not the point. You asked me to pay. The point is your dog treats my garden like his own personal." She stopped, visibly deciding that wasn't worth the breath. Just fix the gap. Wherever he got through this time. Cole glanced past her toward the fence line, unhurried. "Which gap?" "I don't know, Cole. I didn't stop to survey it. I was busy losing a foot race to a 12-year-old dog." Something in his face moved again, closer to a real, almost smile this time. "I'll find it," he said. The gap held 11 days. On the 12th, Samson found an entirely new one, and Ivy found 6 ruined lettuce starts, and a dog sitting in the middle of them with an expression of total innocence. This time Cole was already on his porch, like he'd heard the whole thing coming before it happened. "You said you fixed it," she called. "I did." "Then explain the lettuce." He looked past her to the second hole, dug clean under a rail that had nothing to do with the gap he'd patched. He dug under. "Different problem. You could have mentioned dogs dig." "Didn't think I needed to." Next time, assume I need everything explained. Apparently, I do. The almost smile came back, a little further this time. Noted. She turned to go, already composing the next thing she'd say to Charlotte about all of this, and had gotten 2 steps toward her own fence line when he said her name. Ivy. She stopped. It was, she realized, the first time he'd ever actually said her name out loud. She'd been on the receiving end of plenty of his 4-word sentences before, but never once addressed by it. She turned back. Whole town's talked about nothing else since the cabbage, he said. It took her a second to understand that was, in its own quiet way, a joke. And when she did, she laughed, the real kind, not the polite one. Cole Bishop watched her do it with an expression she couldn't read, didn't say anything else, and went back to work. The dog kept finding new ways under, over, and occasionally straight through the fence line for the rest of that spring. And Ivy stopped being entirely certain the dog was the one to blame for all of it. Cedar Hollow noticed the pattern before either of them did. Small towns are efficient that way. "You're at the Bishop fence line an awful lot for a woman with a grievance against his dog," said Ivy's friend Charlotte, who ran the mercantile counter and considered gossip a civic duty. 3 times this week. His dog is a menace, Ivy said. His dog has apparently only breached your garden twice this month. You've been over there 5 times. I'm making sure he's actually fixed the fence. Uh-huh. Charlotte wound a length of ribbon around her finger with the patience of a woman who'd already decided she was right and was willing to wait for the world to catch up. And how's the fence looking these days? Ivy didn't have a good answer to that, mostly because the fence, by early June, was in excellent repair, and she'd run out of legitimate reasons to be standing at the property line twice a week and had started going anyway. What she wouldn't have admitted, not to Charlotte, not to her mother, was that she'd started noticing things about Cole Bishop that had nothing to do with fences. That he was up before dawn every morning, working his own land with a discipline that made her own early rising look casual. That he never spoke more than he needed to, but when he did, he meant every word of it. That he'd mended the widow Carter's porch step without being asked or paid, and hadn't mentioned it to a soul. Ivy only found out because the widow herself brought it up in church, with no idea Cole would rather she hadn't. That when Samson barreled into her yard for the 9th time that summer and she yelled at him properly, hands on hips, full volume, the dog's ears went back and his tail dropped, and behind him, up at the fence, Cole was watching her do it with an expression that wasn't annoyance, wasn't quite amusement either, but something quieter and more attentive than both. "You're not scared of him," Cole said once, when she'd marched the dog back herself, gripping his collar with the easy confidence of a woman who'd handled livestock her whole life. "Should I be?" Most people talk around him, talk soft, like he might bite. "He's a dog who eats cabbage, Cole, not a wolf." Something shifted in his face, small, almost nothing, but she was starting to learn the vocabulary of his almost nothings. "No," he agreed, "not a wolf." She didn't know then why that exchange seemed to matter to him more than it should have. She'd understand it much later, when she knew what kind of things he'd hunted once, that had been a great deal closer to wolves than any dog ever was, and would understand that a woman unafraid of Samson, unafraid of anything with teeth, had touched something in him he hadn't expected to still be capable of feeling. If you're enjoying Cole and Ivy's story so far, consider subscribing. There's a lot more of Cedar Hollow still to come. Now, back to that summer, because Cole Bishop is about to get a lot harder for Ivy to ignore. By July, the pattern of their days had settled into something neither of them had planned, and both had, without discussing it, agreed to. She brought over extra vegetables, more than her mother could can, she told herself, though the amount crept up steadily as summer went on. And she'd started timing her trips for whichever hour he was likely to be out in the yard. He fixed things at her farm without being asked. A loose hinge on the tool shed one week, a wobbling porch rail the next, arriving with his own tools and leaving before she could properly thank him, as though the thanking was the part he hadn't planned for. Then, one bright Saturday in the middle of the month, the well pump. It had been sticking for 2 years. Ivy had simply learned to live with it, the way she'd learned to live with a great many small burdens since her father died, priming it twice, sometimes 3 times, before it gave up water, and never once thinking to ask anyone to look at it, because asking had quietly stopped being a thing she did. Cole crouched over the pump head with a wrench, working the mechanism loose with the same unhurried patience he brought to everything, and Ivy stood beside him, handing over tools before he asked for them, having learned his rhythm without ever meaning to. 2 years, he said, not looking up. What? Packing's worn clean through. Takes about that long usually. He glanced at her. You've been fighting this thing 2 years. It works fine if you prime it right. Didn't ask if it worked, asked why you never called anybody. Ivy opened her mouth to say something quick and found, for once, that the quick answer wasn't the true one. She looked past him, out toward the garden rows instead of at his face. There wasn't anybody to call, she said finally. Not after my father. You get used to just doing it yourself. All of it. Long enough it stops feeling like something you're doing without help. It just feels like how things are. Cole's hands went still on the wrench for a moment. He didn't look up right away, and when he did, there was none of the careful pity she'd braced for from other men who'd heard that particular story. Just the same steady attention he gave everything. He tightened a fitting, tested the handle, and watched the water come up clean and easy on the first pull. You don't have to do all of it alone, he said. Not gently, exactly. Cole didn't do gentle, not the way most men meant it, but plainly, the way he said everything, like a fact he'd already decided was worth stating out loud. Ivy considered that for a moment, turning the handle of the trowel over in her hands. You don't have to fix everything either, she said back. I know. Then why do you? He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all, which, by then, she'd learned wasn't rudeness, just the shape of how he thought. Slow and deliberate, unwilling to say a thing until he'd found the true version of it. Spent a long time, he said finally, doing work that broke things. Feels better fixing them instead. It was the closest he'd come to telling her anything real about the 11 years, and she understood, with the instinct of someone who'd also learned to carry things quietly, not to push for more. She only nodded and handed him the next wrench, and let the moment settle between them the way most of their moments did, without ceremony, without drama. Simply 2 people occupying the same patch of ground and finding, gradually, that they preferred it that way. She stayed longer than the pump required, handing him tools before he asked, watching the light go gold over the rows behind her house. By the time she walked back across the grass that evening, the vegetables in her basket had gone soft in the heat, and she hadn't noticed. And up at the fence, Samson watched her go with the mild interest of a dog who'd long since stopped seeing much difference between the 2 properties. Ruth's cough turned in the 3rd week of July. A tickle at first, easy to wave off. Then within 2 days, something that rattled low in her chest and left her gray-faced by the wood stove, no matter how many shawls Ivy piled around her shoulders. Ivy didn't sleep. She sat up with a basin of cool water and a cloth, pressing it to her mother's forehead through the worst of the fever, and did not let herself say out loud the fear climbing higher in her chest with every hour Ruth's breathing stayed thin and quick. By the 2nd night, her hands had gone unsteady from exhaustion, and she still hadn't sent for anyone. There wasn't a doctor in Cedar Hollow, only one 2 towns over, 4 hours' ride on a good horse, and she couldn't leave her mother's side long enough to fetch him herself. She didn't know, until the 2nd dawn, that she hadn't needed to. Cole arrived on the road just past sunup, leading a 2nd horse behind his own, and on it, saddle sore and blinking in the early light, a doctor Ivy had never met. You didn't have to do that, Ivy said, standing on her porch at dawn, exhausted, blinking at him and the doctor both. I know, Cole said. Then why? Because you needed it, he said simply, as if that settled the matter entirely. And for him, it clearly did. He'd seen it happening before she ever told him, he said later. Plain fact, not drama. Ivy hauling water up from the well at odd hours, a basin balanced against her hip, a damp cloth over her shoulder. No sign of her at the fence 2 days running, the first she'd missed since June. And the lamp in her window still burning late, 2 nights running, long after every other window in the valley had gone dark. He hadn't needed more than that. Ruth recovered. A bad summer fever, the doctor said, nothing worse, though it had frightened Ivy badly enough that she didn't sleep properly for a week after, jumping at every cough that drifted in from the next room. Cole came by each of those mornings, not to fix anything this time, there was nothing broken to fix, just to sit on the porch step beside her while the coffee went cold between them and let her talk. She talked the way she always did, fast and rushing, running through every fear she'd carried those 3 nights and hadn't let herself say out loud. And Cole listened the way he listened to everything, without once looking like he was waiting for his turn. When she finally ran out of words, he'd say exactly 4 or 5 of his own, something plain and small, about the weather or the horse, or nothing in particular, and let the quiet hold the rest of it. One morning, talked out and quiet, staring at the fence line without really seeing it, she heard him say, "Tough woman, your mother." "She is." "Raised you." "She did." "Explains some things," he said, and there was, underneath the flatness of it, something that might have been the start of a compliment. Ivy was too tired to do anything but let it land soft instead of arguing with it, the way she might have on any other morning. It was on one of those mornings, with her mother finally sleeping easy inside, and the sun coming up gold over the fence line Samson had made a permanent habit of, that Ivy looked over at Cole sitting beside her, worn hat turning slowly in his hands, and understood something she hadn't quite let herself see until then. It didn't come all at once, the way she'd have expected love to arrive if anyone had asked her beforehand. It came the way a sunrise does, the light changing for a while before you notice you're the one who finally looked up. She had fallen in love with the quietest man in Cedar Hollow, and she had absolutely no idea what to do about it, because in 11 words a day, he had given her nothing that told her whether he felt the same. It was late August when Cedar Hollow got its first real look at what kind of man had been living quietly on the old Hutchins place. A pair of horses had gone missing from the livery 2 towns over, and word came through with a drover passing east that the men responsible, 3 of them, wanted on paper in 2 territories, had been working their way north along the river on stolen horses, changing mounts as they went, taking what they needed from isolated farms and moving on before anyone could raise an alarm. Cedar Hollow, small and undefended and sitting exactly on that river, hadn't slept well in a week. Men took turns walking the road at night. Women locked doors that had never needed locking. Ivy found the fence at the north pasture down on a Tuesday morning, not broken by Samson this time, but cut clean with a blade, 3 rails laid flat, and 2 of her mother's better horses gone from the paddock. She stood there a long moment, stomach cold, and then didn't go to the sheriff's office in town, 4 miles off. She went to the fence line. Cole was already outside, crouched at the cut rails, reading the ground the way she'd never once seen him read anything. Not slow, not careful in the unhurried way she knew, but quick, precise, entirely silent, moving from the cut fence to the trampled grass to a boot print half filled with dew. "2 men," he said, "maybe an hour ago, headed for the river crossing." He started for his horse, then stopped himself at the gate, crouching again over a second set of prints crossing the first. Someone had doubled back a short way before the crossing, a boot dragged sideways in the mud. A horse pulled off the track and led back onto it a few yards on. The kind of careless correction a man makes when he wants to look headed somewhere he isn't. Cole read it twice before he trusted it, swore low under his breath, and swung up onto his horse, bound not for the river crossing after all, but for the old switchback trail north of it. He stood a moment before he rode, and for the first time since she'd met him, Ivy saw something in his face that wasn't careful, wasn't quiet, was simply, coldly certain. "Cole." "Stay with your mother," he said. "Bar the door. I'll bring the horses back." "That's not... You can't just..." "Ivy." He said her name the way he said everything, plain and complete. But there was iron under it now she hadn't heard before. 11 years finding men who didn't want finding. This is smaller than most of those. I need you inside, where I'm not thinking about you while I work. She wanted to argue. Every instinct in her wanted to go with him, to do something rather than wait. But she looked at the stillness that had come over him, nothing like anything she'd seen in 5 months of fence lines and well pumps, and understood that this wasn't a man asking for her help. It was a man asking her to trust he didn't need it, and that trusting him mattered more, just then, than her own wish to be useful. "Bring them back," she said. "Both of them, the horses and yourself." Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite a smile, close enough to its cousin. "Both," he agreed. She did as he asked, more from the certainty in his voice than any real willingness to be sent inside. She barred the door, drew the curtain back an inch to watch him go, and sat with her mother at the kitchen table, both of them listening for hoofbeats and hearing nothing, the untouched mending going cold in Ruth's lap. He was gone 4 hours. Ivy spent all 4 of those hours at the window, her mother's hand gripped tight in her own, listening for hoofbeats and hearing nothing. When Cole finally came up the road at dusk, leading both missing horses on a line behind his own, moving at an unhurried walk, as though he'd simply gone to fetch them from a neighbor's pasture, she was off the porch and across the yard before he'd even brought his own horse to a stop. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Where are they? The men?" "Sheriff's got 'em. Found 'em above the switchback, still deciding which way to run." He swung down from the saddle, and up close she could see what she'd missed at a distance. A scrape along his jaw, a slight stiffness in how he held his left arm. Small things a man like Cole Bishop would never think worth mentioning. "You're hurt." "Bruised, not hurt." He handed her the lead line for her mother's mare, steady as ever, as though he hadn't just spent the afternoon doing exactly the kind of work he'd bought 40 acres in Cedar Hollow to leave behind. "Fence needs mending again." "Cole." She stood there holding the lead line, looking at him in the fading light, and found she'd run entirely out of things to say for the second time in their acquaintance. "You didn't have to do that. You could have sent for the sheriff first." "Could have," he agreed. "Would have taken longer. Horses would have been sold off by the time anybody got there." The iron had gone out of his face now, leaving only the familiar quiet. 11 years finding men who didn't want finding. Wasn't going to let 2 of them keep something that was yours. She didn't answer that. Instead, she took his arm, the good one, and steered him toward the porch step with a firmness that left no room for argument. "Sit down. It's nothing. You rode after 2 horse thieves for something that wasn't yours. Sit down." He sat. She fetched water and a clean cloth from the kitchen and knelt in front of him on the step, tipping his chin up with 2 fingers to see the scrape properly, and Cole went very still under her hands, in a way that had nothing to do with pain. "Hold still," she said, when he flinched at the cloth. "I am." "You're not." He was, after that, and let her clean the scrape without another word, watching her face instead of the fading light behind her, and when she finally sat back and asked him, quietly, not sure she wanted the answer, why he'd ridden into that kind of danger for 2 horses that belonged to someone else, he said only, "They were yours." She didn't have anything to say to that, either. For a moment, neither of them moved, her fingers still resting near his jaw, his eyes steady on hers in a way that had nothing careful left in it. Then she stood, because standing was safer than staying where she was, and went to see about supper instead, and let the ordinary, unremarkable end of an extraordinary day settle around the 3 of them like something solid finally set back into place. The town, naturally, had theories. "He's sweet on her," Charlotte announced at the Mercantile, with the flat certainty of a woman stating a fact of nature. "Man doesn't ride down horse thieves for a family that isn't his." Ruth, informed of this secondhand, said only, Well, he does seem to be at our fence a great deal for a man who bought 40 acres specifically to be left alone, and went back to her mending with the particular satisfaction of a mother who suspects she already knows how a story ends. The harvest dance came in September, same as it did every year, at the Grange Hall with too much cider and too little space. Lanterns strung low over the crowd, and the whole town crammed in, celebrating having gotten through another summer. Ivy went with Charlotte, in a blue dress her mother had helped her let out at the seams, and didn't expect Cole Bishop to be there at all, because Cole Bishop did not go to things. Cole Bishop was there. He stood at the edge of the room in his one good coat, hat turning slowly in his hands, looking like a man doing something that cost him considerable effort. When Ivy crossed the floor toward him, because she had never once in her life waited for someone else to make the first move, and saw no reason to start now, he watched her come the way he watched everything, careful and complete, and entirely without pretending to be looking elsewhere. "You came," she said. "Didn't want to," he admitted, which from most men would have been an insult, and from Cole was simply the truth, offered plainly, the way he offered everything. "Came anyway." "Why?" He was quiet a moment. Around them the fiddles started up, couples moving toward the floor, and somewhere behind Ivy a young man named Whitfield, who'd been trying to court her since spring, was making his way over with obvious intentions. "Because you'd be here," Cole said, "and I've gotten used to knowing where you are." It was, for Cole Bishop, practically a sonnet. Ivy felt it land somewhere under her ribs, and before she could find an answer worth the moment, Whitfield arrived with a hopeful smile and a request for a dance. Watching something flicker and go carefully still in Cole's face, Ivy made a decision she wouldn't fully understand the courage of until much later. "Thank you," she told Whitfield, "but I've already promised this one." She turned to Cole. "Haven't I?" He looked at her a long moment, long enough that she wondered if she'd read months of fence lines and well pumps and 4-hour rides in the dark entirely wrong. Then he held out his hand. "You have," he said. He was not a good dancer. His hand at her waist was careful to the point of stiffness, like a man handling something he was afraid of damaging, and he counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, off the beat more often than on it. Ivy didn't tease him for it, not the way she might have with anyone else. She let her hand rest light on his shoulder and matched her steps to his instead of the fiddles. And after a moment he seemed to notice, and the counting slowed. He stepped on the hem of her dress once and apologized for it with such grave seriousness, as if he'd done her some real injury, that she laughed out loud in the middle of the floor. The real kind, the kind that carried. Something in him came loose at the sound of it, some final held breath. And after that he stopped counting altogether and simply moved with her, careful and unhurried, the way he did everything. For a while neither of them said anything. The fiddle carried on without needing them to pay it any mind, and Ivy became aware, gradually, that the hand at her waist had stopped being careful in the stiff way and gone careful in a different way entirely, that his shoulders had come down from around his ears, that he was, quite possibly for the first time since she'd met him, not bracing for anything at all. She thought that she had never in her life felt so entirely and specifically seen. "You're smiling," she said. "Might be," he agreed. Across the room, she caught Charlotte's face over Hiram Foss's shoulder, eyes gone wide as a barn door, the exact look of a woman already composing tomorrow's version of this story for the mercantile counter. Cole Bishop is smiling in public. Charlotte will never recover. Let her talk. She's been talking since June. "I know," Cole said, and something in the way he said it told her he'd known exactly what the town had been saying, had heard every word of it, and had let it sit there unanswered because he hadn't yet found the courage to make it true. He found the courage 3 days later, arriving at her fence line, not because Samson had gotten loose, not because anything needed fixing, but simply standing there in the early morning with his hat in his hands, the way he'd held it on her porch step in July, waiting until she came out to the garden and saw him. "You're not fixing anything," she said. "No." "Then what are you doing here?" Cole Bishop, who had spent 11 years learning to say as little as possible and mean every word of it, took a breath and said the most words she had ever heard him say at once. I bought 40 acres in a town where nobody knew me because I didn't want to be known. Didn't want anybody close enough to see what I used to be. Then Samson found your garden, and somewhere between the cabbage, the lettuce, and you billing me every time he got through, I stopped having quiet weeks. Haven't wanted one back since. I think about you before I think about anything else most mornings, and I don't know how to say that any prettier than plain, because plain is all I've got. But I wanted you to know it, whatever you do with it. Ivy Larkin, who talked fast about everything, who had an opinion ready for every occasion, found herself, for one of the only times in her life, entirely without words. So she crossed the grass between them instead, and stood in front of him, and said the only thing that felt true enough to match what he'd just given her. Plain is fine, she said. Plain is exactly what I wanted. Then she kissed him, because she had never once in her life waited for someone else to make the last move either. And Cole Bishop, quiet, careful, closed off Cole Bishop, who'd spent 14 months teaching himself how to be still, stood in his own ruined then rebuilt fence line and let himself, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember, be entirely undone. Up at the house, Ruth Larkin, glancing out the kitchen window at exactly the wrong, or exactly the right, moment, set down her mending and did not pretend she hadn't seen a thing. They married in October, in the small church at Cedar Hollow, with Ruth crying happily in the front pew, and Charlotte insisting, to anyone who'd listen, that she'd known since June, and Samson tied to a post outside with a ribbon around his neck that he immediately tried to eat. Present as the closest thing Cole had to family before the wedding, and an honored guest by the end of it. It was a small wedding, over quickly, the way weddings tended to be in a town too busy with harvest to make much fuss of anything. But it was, by every account after, the happiest anyone in Cedar Hollow could remember Cole Bishop looking. Cole moved his 40 acres and hers into one. The fence line that had caused so much trouble came down entirely rather than getting mended again, because, as Ivy pointed out, there was no longer any reason to keep a dog fenced to only half the ground he was welcome on. They had 2 children in the years that followed, a boy who inherited his father's careful hands and his mother's relentless energy in roughly equal measure, and a girl who talked before she walked and never really stopped either. The garden grew. The cabbages, in particular, grew undisturbed, because Samson, well into his old age by then, had settled into a strange and lasting truce with the vegetable rows, as if he'd decided, once the fence came down, that there was no longer any sport in trespassing on ground that was already his. Some mornings, if you walked out past the old property line, the one nobody bothered marking anymore, you'd find him there still, stretched out flat in the shade between the cabbages, entirely unbothered, guarding a garden that had never once needed guarding from him. Thank you for riding with me today. Wherever you are, I'm grateful you were here. Until next time, keep riding.